The man had said to wait. And so Lin Wei waited. She sat on the hard bench of the dusty train station in Redemption, a town whose name felt like a cruel joke. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the splintered planks of the platform, on the tin roof of the station, on the grey silk of her worn cheongsam. It was a good dress, meant for a wedding that would not happen. The man, a go-between named Mr. Chen, who had arranged everything, had taken her papers, her passage money, and the small sum her family had scraped together for her dowry. He had taken it all, smiled a reassuring smile, and told her to wait right here for her intended, a prosperous merchant. Then he had boarded the eastbound train himself, and his smile was the last she saw of him. That was yesterday. The sun had set, and the station agent had looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion before locking the doors for the night. She had slept on the bench, her worn leather suitcase clutched to her chest, the world a terrifying canvas of strange stars and the howling of coyotes. Now the sun was high again, and the hope she had clung to through the night had evaporated with the morning dew. She was alone. She had no money, a handful of English words, and the crushing weight of a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. Every person who passed, every dusty cowboy and weary woman in a bonnet, looked through her as if she were a ghost. She was less than a ghost. She was a problem someone else would have to solve. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the scuffed toes of her silk slippers, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the grey of her dress and the grey of her despair. Then, a small voice cut through the haze of her fear. "Are you lost?" Lin Wei looked up. A little girl stood before her, no more than 7 years old. She wore a simple prairie dress the color of dried corn husks and clutched a threadbare teddy bear with one button eye. Her hair was the color of wheat, braided into 2 neat plaits, and her eyes were a startling, curious blue. Lin Wei did not have the words to answer. She could only shake her head, a small, helpless gesture. The girl tilted her head, considering her. She took a step closer, her gaze falling on the tears that tracked clean paths through the dust on Lin Wei's cheeks. The girl's expression softened from curiosity to a solemn, childish understanding. She looked from Lin Wei's face to her own father, a tall man who stood a few paces away, his face etched with a weariness that seemed older than his years. He had a gun belt strapped to his hips, the leather dark and oiled, a tool of his trade that made him seem both dangerous and permanent, like a feature of the landscape. He watched them, his expression unreadable. The little girl turned back to Lin Wei. She took another step, her small hand reaching out, not to touch, but as if to bridge the enormous gulf between them. Then she spoke the words, clear and direct, with the unshakable logic of a child. "Will you be my mama?" The man, the girl's father, moved then. He walked toward them, his boots loud on the wooden platform. He was lean and weathered, with dust in the creases around his eyes. He looked at Lin Wei, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was profoundly tired. He had seen too much of the world's trouble to be surprised by her presence. "Rose," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Don't bother the lady." The little girl, Rose, ignored him. She kept her wide, hopeful eyes fixed on Lin Wei. "She's not a bother, Papa." She said. Jacob Thorne looked down at his daughter, and for a moment, the hardness in his face softened. He then looked back at Lin Wei, taking in the fine, travel-stained dress, the small, solitary suitcase, the quiet dignity in her posture that fought against the terror in her eyes. He knew the story, or enough of it. He'd seen girls like her before, brought over on a promise that dissolved the moment they stepped off the train. He sighed, a sound of resignation. He was not a man who invited complications. His life was pared down to the bone, his children, his ranch, and the ghosts he carried. There was no room for anyone else. But Rose was looking at him now with an expression of fierce expectation. She was the one part of his life that could still command him. "We can't just leave her," she whispered, a secret between the 3 of them. Jacob ran a hand over his face. He was thinking of the meager stores in his pantry, of the extra work, of the way a stranger's presence would disrupt the fragile peace he had built around his grief. "She can come for supper," he said, the words feeling like a concession he couldn't afford. It was not a promise of anything more. It was a single meal. a temporary reprieve from the sun and the staring. For Lin Wei, who had expected nothing, it felt like a staggering generosity. She looked from the man's guarded face to the girl's shining one. She gave a small, stiff nod. She had no other choice. She picked up her suitcase, its weight the only familiar thing in this entire, terrifying country, and followed the gunslinger and his daughter away from the station, into the vast, indifferent landscape of the West. The walk to the Thorn Ranch was long and silent, broken only by Rose's occasional chatter to her bear. The land was beautiful and brutal, a sweep of golden grass and distant, purple mountains under a sky so vast it made Lin Wei feel like a speck of dust. Jacob Thorne walked ahead, his long strides eating up the dry ground. He did not speak. He seemed a man who had used up all his words long ago. The ranch was a small, defensible collection of buildings huddled against the base of a low hill, a simple clapboard house, a sturdy barn, and a web of corrals. It was neat, well tended, but it was achingly quiet. There was no laughter spilling from the windows, no sign of life beyond a few chickens scratching in the dirt. When they entered the house, the silence deepened. It was a house built around an absence. The air was thick with the memory of someone who was no longer there. In the main room, a rocking chair sat empty by the cold hearth. On the wall, a faded needlepoint sampler read, "Sarah Thorne." Her hand and heart grief was in the very walls, in the way the sunlight fell across the scrubbed but bare wooden floors. A boy of about 12, with his father's serious eyes and a stubborn set to his jaw, stood by the table. He looked at Lin Wei with open suspicion. "Samuel, this is a visitor," Jacob said, the word hanging awkwardly in the air. "She'll be taking supper with us." Samuel said nothing. He just stared, his arms crossed, a small sentinel guarding his family's sorrow. The meal was as quiet as the house. A stew of beans and salted pork, hard biscuits, and water. Jacob and Samuel ate with a grim efficiency. Rose tried to fill the silence, telling Lin Wei about her schoolteacher and a hawk she had seen that morning. Lin Wei ate last, after serving the others, taking the smallest portion for herself. It was a habit born of a lifetime of being female and last in line, a habit she did not even think about. But Jacob noticed. He saw the way she held herself, poised and contained, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. After the meal, she rose without a word and began to gather the plates. Samuel moved to stop her. "I do that," he said, his voice sharp. "It's my chore." Jacob put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let her," he said quietly. And so Lin Wei washed the dishes in the small basin, her movements economical and precise. She was aware of all of them watching her, 3 pairs of eyes judging her, measuring her. She did not know what they saw. She only knew that her bag was packed, and the moment this fragile truce ended, she would be back at that station. She was given a small room off the kitchen, little more than a storage closet with a narrow cot. It was clean, but stark. She placed her suitcase on the floor beside the bed. She did not unpack. There was no point. Lin Wei did not wait to be asked. She rose before the sun, when the air was still cool and smelled of dust and sage. The house was quiet, the others still asleep. She moved silently, finding the kitchen as if she had always known it. The pantry was sparse, as Jacob's face had suggested. A sack of flour, a dwindling bag of beans, a little rice, some salt pork. It was the arithmetic of survival, and she understood it well. She started with one small thing at a time. She built up the fire in the stove, her movements practiced and sure. She took a small amount of the rice, washed it, and set it to boil with a great deal of water, letting it simmer down into a soft, comforting congee. It was a breakfast of her homeland, a meal of gentle warmth that asked for very little. While it cooked, she stepped outside. Beyond the house was a small, neglected patch of earth that had once been a vegetable garden. It was choked with weeds, the soil dry and cracked, but she could see the ghosts of old rows. A few stubborn squash vines clung to life. She found a rusty hoe leaning against the house and began to work, her hands pulling at the tough, thorny weeds, clearing the ground with a slow, patient rhythm. The sun rose higher, and the family emerged. They found her in the garden, her grey dress now smudged with dirt, her face set in concentration. They said nothing. At the table, she served the warm rice porridge. Samuel looked at it with suspicion, but Rose dug in with relish. Jacob ate his bowl slowly, his eyes on Lin Wei. It was the first truly warm thing he'd eaten in months that hadn't come out of a can or a stew pot. After the silent breakfast, she went back to work. She found a pile of mending in a basket, shirts with torn cuffs and trousers with worn knees. She found a small sewing kit in her own suitcase, a relic of her old life, and sat on the porch steps, stitching. The stitches were tiny, neat, and almost invisible. One small thing at a time. A weeded row. A warm meal. A mended shirt. This was her language. It was the only one she had to prove she was more than a burden. She did not ask for thanks, and none was offered. But the house began to change in subtle ways. It smelled of baking bread instead of just dust. The children's clothes were whole again. The garden began to show neat rows of dark, turned earth. Rose became her constant shadow, following her through her chores, chattering away, holding up her bear for Lin Wei to inspect. Samuel kept his distance, but he watched her. He watched the way her hands were never idle, the way she moved with a quiet purpose that was the opposite of his father's restless, pacing energy. He watched her, and the hard knot of his resentment began to loosen, just a little. Rose had accepted her from the first moment, her heart as open as the prairie sky. The little girl's trust was a small, warm flame in the cold emptiness of Lin Wei's new life. She would bring Lin Wei treasures, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a handful of wildflowers. In return, Lin Wei taught her things from her own childhood. She showed her how to make intricate shapes with a simple loop of string, creating a cat's cradle, a cup and saucer, a bridge. Rose was mesmerized. For hours, they would sit on the porch, their hands and the string moving together, a silent conversation that needed no translation. Rose would rest her head against Lin Wei's knee, a casual gesture of belonging that made Lin Wei's throat tighten. The true test, however, was Samuel. He remained a fortress of childish grief and premature responsibility. He saw Lin Wei not as a person, but as an intrusion, a presence that threatened to fill the space his mother had left. He resisted her quiet competence, doing his chores with a grim determination, as if to prove she was not needed. He tested her in small ways, leaving the wood box almost empty, tracking mud onto the floor she had just swept. She never rose to the bait. She simply refilled the box and cleaned the floor, her composure a quiet rebuke to his anger. The thaw came on a hot, breathless afternoon. Samuel was trying to repair a section of broken fence far from the house. He was clumsy with frustration, hammering with more force than accuracy. The hammer slipped, striking his hand with a sickening crack. He cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, before biting it back. He was his father's son, he would not show weakness. He stumbled back to the house, cradling his hand, his face pale, a line of blood welling up from a deep gash across his knuckles. Jacob was out, checking the north pasture. Rose was napping. Lin Wei was the only one there. She saw him from the window and was at the door before he reached it. He tried to brush past her, muttering, "It's nothing," but she saw the blood and the unnatural angle of his finger. She took his arm gently but firmly and led him to the kitchen table. He was braced for a fuss, for useless flapping. Instead, she was calm. Her touch was cool and certain. She sent him to fetch clean water while she gathered supplies. From the garden, she picked several broadleaf plantain leaves, which she washed and crushed into a green paste. She cleaned the wound with a startling efficiency, her movements deft and painless. He watched, fascinated in spite of himself, as she applied the herbal poultice before binding his hand tightly with strips of clean cloth. "It will stop the bleeding," she said, her English soft and careful. "And keep it from swelling." He stared at his neatly wrapped hand. The throbbing was already starting to subside. He had expected it to hurt more. He looked up at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the concern in her dark eyes, the quiet strength in her face. He felt a confusing mix of gratitude and shame. He had been cruel to her, and she had shown him nothing but kindness. He mumbled a thanks, the word sounding foreign in his own mouth. The next morning, when Lin Wei stepped outside to fetch water from the well, a full, heavy bucket was already sitting on the porch steps, right where she would stand. Samuel was nowhere to be seen, but the message was clear. It was his apology. It was his acceptance. Jacob Thorne was a man who spoke with his hands. Words were difficult, tangled things, too small to hold the weight of what he felt. But he could fix a broken hinge, gentle a spooked horse, or build a fence that would stand against the wind. It was how he had loved his wife, and it was how he managed his grief. He said nothing of the changes in his home, but he noticed everything. He noticed the way the scent of herbs now clung to the kitchen, the way the children's laughter, especially Rose's, was more frequent. He noticed the neat stack of mended shirts in his drawer, the stitches so fine they were like a whisper. He noticed how Samuel no longer watched Lin Wei with suspicion, but with a quiet respect. He saw all of this, and a silent conversation began between them, a dialogue of actions. He saw that the thin silk of her slippers was no match for the harsh ground of the ranch. One evening, he took them while she slept. He worked by lamplight in his barn, the air smelling of leather and oil. He cut new soles from a piece of thick, sturdy hide, carefully stitching them to the delicate uppers. He reinforced the seams and rubbed the leather with tallow to make it waterproof. The next morning, the repaired shoes were sitting by her door. There was no note. No explanation. He just saw a problem and fixed it. He watched her struggle to split the large logs he brought in for the stove. The axe was too heavy, the wood too dense. So he began to spend a few minutes each evening splitting a separate pile of smaller kindling, stacking it neatly by the kitchen door for her. He never mentioned it, and she never thanked him for it. It was simply there, a piece of his strength offered to supplement hers. The most significant gesture came weeks later. Lin Wei still kept all her meager belongings in the single suitcase beside her cot. It remained packed, a symbol of her temporary status, a constant reminder that she was ready to leave at a moment's notice. It was a statement of non-presumption. One afternoon, she returned from the garden to find Jacob in her small room. He was finishing hammering the last nail into a set of simple, unadorned shelves he had built on the wall above her bed. They were made of smooth plain pine, and they smelled of fresh-cut wood. He nodded at them, his face impassive. "For your things," he said, and then he left, as if embarrassed by the intimacy of the act. It was more than just shelves. It was an invitation. It was a quiet plea. It was the closest he could come to saying he wanted her to stay. Lin Wei ran her hand over the smooth wood. She looked at the shelves, and then at her closed suitcase on the floor. For the first time, she felt the powerful, terrifying pull of hope. But the habit of caution was too strong. She did not unpack. Not yet. The precarious peace of the Thorne Ranch was broken by the arrival of a man on a fine black horse. He was dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the dusty landscape, his face clean-shaven and his smile confident. This was Silas Blackwood, the man who owned the bank in town and a great deal of the land surrounding it. He dismounted with an air of ownership, nodding to Jacob as if he were a hired hand. "Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Just making my rounds. Checking on my investments." Jacob's body went rigid. "Blackwood," he replied, his tone flat. Blackwood's eye scanned the property, noting the newly weeded garden, the mended fence line. His gaze landed on Lin Wei, who was shaking a rug on the porch. His smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. "Well, now. It seems you've found some help. That's good. A man with your responsibilities needs all the help he can get." He walked over to Jacob, lowering his voice so Lin Wei could not hear. But the wind carried fragments of their conversation to her. "The note, Thorne. Time is running out. I've been patient, more than patient, considering the circumstances." Jacob's replies were terse, stones thrown against a wall. "The harvest was poor. Just need more time." "Time is money," Blackwood said, his voice still infuriatingly pleasant. Everyone knows that he clapped Jacob on the shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie that was more like a threat. Before leaving, he turned his attention back to Lin Wei. He walked up the porch steps, his polished boots silent. "And who might this be?" he asked, looking directly at her. She shrank back, intimidated by his directness. "She's helping us," Jacob said from behind him. Blackwood's eyes lingered on her, a flicker of something calculating in their depths. "I see," he said slowly. He tipped his hat. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a heavy, anxious silence. After he was gone, the tension in Jacob did not dissipate. He stared out at his land, at the fields that should have been his salvation, with a look of profound despair. Lin Wei saw it then, the first sign of something deeply wrong. This was good land. Jacob was a hard worker. The children were not extravagant. Yet they lived on the very edge of ruin, perpetually beholden to a man like Blackwood. The numbers, the quiet arithmetic of their lives, did not add up. There was a secret here, a weight that was pressing Jacob into the dust. And she, an outsider, had no right to ask what it was. She filed the observation away, a small, sharp stone in the pocket of her mind. The summer heat, which had been a relentless, baking presence, finally broke. But it did not break into gentle relief. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-grey, and the wind began to howl, picking up dust and grit. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the dry yard into a sea of thick, clinging mud. The storm trapped them inside the small house, the world reduced to the sound of wind rattling the windows and rain drumming on the roof. It was on the second day of the storm that Rose began to cough. At first, it was small and dry, but by nightfall, it had deepened into a ragged, painful sound that echoed in the small house. A fever followed, hot and fierce. Her small body burned with it, her breathing grew shallow, and she drifted in and out of a restless, delirious sleep. Jacob was undone. All the dangers he could face with a gun, a wolf, a bandit, a man like Blackwood, were useless against this invisible enemy. He paced the floor of the main room, his helplessness a palpable force, his face a mask of terror. He was reliving another sickbed, another fever he had been powerless to stop. Samuel sat by his sister's bed, trying to be brave, but his small face was pinched with fear. The doctor was in Redemption, a full day's ride in good weather. With the creek flooded and the roads turned to rivers of mud, he was on another planet. They were alone. It was in this moment of rising panic that Lin Wei's quietness transformed into a profound calm. She had seen this fever before. She knew its patterns, its dangers. She took charge, not with loud commands, but with a steady, focused energy that cut through their fear. "We need herbs," she said to Jacob, her voice even. "From the hillside. I will show you." She described the plants she needed: yarrow for the fever, mullein for the cough, elderflower for the aches. Leaving Samuel to watch his sister, she and Jacob ventured out into the storm. Wrapped in oilskins, they fought against the wind and rain as she pointed out the humble, powerful plants growing amongst the rocks. Back in the warm kitchen, she worked with a pharmacist's precision. She brewed bitter teas, steeped poultices, and filled the room with the scent of steaming herbs. She sat by Rose's bedside through the long night, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring soft words in her own language, a sound as soothing as the rain. Jacob watched her from the doorway, a silent, hulking shadow. He saw in her a competence, a strength, that shamed his own frantic despair. She was not just a helper. She was a healer. She was fighting for his daughter's life with a knowledge that seemed to come from the earth itself. The fever broke just before dawn. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and a pale, watery light filtered through the windows. Rose's breathing was easier, her skin cool to the touch. She was weak, exhausted, but she was safe. Lin Wei, who had not slept, finally allowed her own exhaustion to claim her, slumping into the chair by the bed. Jacob found her there, her head bowed, her hand still resting on the edge of the cot. He gently placed a blanket over her shoulders, an act of profound, unspoken gratitude. Later that morning, the silence in the kitchen was different. The storm had passed, and the anxiety that had filled the house had receded with it. There was a new quiet, one of shared relief and intimacy. Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one on the table in front of Lin Wei. He sat opposite her, cradling his own cup. For a long time, he just looked at her. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "How?" he asked. "How did you know what to do?" Lin Wei looked down at her hands. The time for secrets was over. She began to speak, her English halting at first, but growing stronger as she found the words. She told him about her family, not merchants, but herbalists, keepers of old knowledge passed down through generations. Her father had been a respected apothecary in their village. She had grown up learning the properties of roots and leaves, the art of balancing remedies. She told him the full story of her journey. It was not a simple arranged marriage. Her family had fallen on hard times. They had sold their last remaining properties to pay for her passage and the bride price demanded by Mr. Chen, who had promised her a new life with a kind, wealthy man in America. It was their last hope. "He took everything," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He left me at the station with a ticket to nowhere." She had arrived not just poor, but destitute, stripped of her family's legacy and her own future. She was a healer with no one to heal, a daughter with no family, a woman with no name that anyone in this country cared to know. Jacob listened, his expression unreadable, but his gaze never left her face. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a victim or a burden, but as a survivor. Her past was as marked by loss as his own. They were 2 broken people, washed up on the same shore. The unspoken thing in the room, the grief for his own wife lost to a fever the doctors couldn't cure, hung between them. He wondered, with a fresh stab of pain, if a woman like Lin Wei could have saved her. He pushed the thought away. It was a cruel, useless question. All that mattered was now. All that mattered was the woman sitting across from him, who had saved his child. A few weeks later, Silas Blackwood returned. He came not on horseback, but in a smart buggy, and this time he was not alone. He brought his wife, a woman whose smile was as brittle and polished as her jewelry. Their arrival was framed as a social call, an act of neighborly concern. "We heard your little girl was unwell," Mrs. Blackwood said, handing over a basket containing a jar of expensive preserves and a small, useless china doll. "We were so worried the visit was a performance, and the entire ranch was their stage." Blackwood's eyes took in the scene with sharp, appraising glances. He saw Rose, pale but healthy, playing on the porch with Lin Wei. He saw the order, the sense of a functioning household, and he recognized Lin Wei as the source of it. His strategy shifted. He directed his conversation to her, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "My dear, you must have been terrified," he said. "To handle such a crisis, all on your own." He let a beat of silence pass. "Jacob mentioned you were taken advantage of by that broker, Chen. A terrible business. I've heard of him. A real scoundrel." He was letting her know he knew her story, her vulnerability. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "A young, capable woman like yourself deserves a proper position. Security. My wife and I, we have a large household. We are always in need of reliable help. If you ever feel you need a more permanent arrangement, you must let us know." It was a poisoned offer, wrapped in the language of charity. He was trying to destabilize the home, to peel her away from them, to leave Jacob isolated and weakened once more. Then, his performance for Lin Wei complete, he turned to Jacob. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of stern business. "Thorn," he said, his voice now cold and hard. "My patience has reached its end. The note on this land is due in 30 days. Not a day more. You will have the full amount, or I will foreclose." He delivered the ultimatum in front of everyone, making the children and Lin Wei witnesses to Jacob's failure. He glanced at Lin Wei as he said it, a silent message passing between them: "This man cannot provide for you. I can." He had turned her presence into a source of pressure, another weight on Jacob's shoulders. He tipped his hat, helped his wife into the buggy, and they departed, leaving Jacob standing in the dust, defeated. That night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Jacob retreated into a stony silence, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on him. Rose and Samuel were subdued, feeling the cold draft of their father's fear. Lin Wei could not sleep. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind. He knew Chen. He knew her story. But it was his calm certainty about the debt that troubled her most. It felt too practiced, too final. She thought of the quiet desperation in Jacob, a man who worked from sunrise to sunset on land that refused to yield a profit. It still didn't make sense. She remembered Jacob mentioning a trunk in the loft, filled with his late wife's belongings, things he couldn't bear to look at. A desperate idea began to form. The next morning, she approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Thorne," she began, "I need some cloth for patching." Rose tore her dress. "Is there any in the trunk?" He flinched at the mention of it but nodded, his face tight. "Take what you need with a candle for light." She climbed the ladder to the dusty loft. The air was still and smelled of dried lavender and old memories. She opened the heavy trunk. Inside were neatly folded dresses, a pair of worn reading glasses, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. And at the very bottom, a thick, leather-bound book. A household ledger. Sarah Thorne's handwriting was clear and elegant. She had recorded every transaction, every penny spent, every dollar earned. Lin Wei's fingers traced the columns, going back years. And then she found it. An entry dated a few months before Sarah's death. It recorded a withdrawal of a significant sum from their savings, an amount that would have been a fortune to them. Beside the entry, Sarah had written in her neat script, "Payment to S. Blackwood for land note," in full. It was there. Proof. Sarah had paid off the debt, but her sudden illness and death, and Jacob's subsequent fog of grief, had allowed Blackwood to conceal the payment and continue to hold the fraudulent debt over him. They did not ride to Blackwood's home. They did not seek a confrontation. The next morning, Jacob hitched the wagon and he, Lin Wei, and the two children rode to town. Lin Wei carried the ledger wrapped in cloth. They walked into the land registry office, a quiet, dusty room that smelled of old paper. Blackwood was there, talking to the clerk. He saw them enter, and a flash of irritation crossed his face. Jacob did not speak. He stood beside Lin Wei as she unwrapped the ledger and placed it on the counter. She opened it to the marked page. Her voice did not tremble. "There is a mistake," she said to the clerk, her English precise. "The Thorne Ranch is paid for." She pointed to the entry. Blackwood began to bluster, to deny, but the clerk, an old man who had known Sarah Thorne, leaned over and studied the familiar handwriting. He looked from the ledger to Blackwood's suddenly pale face. No threats were made. No gun was drawn. In the quiet, dusty office, the simple, undeniable truth laid out in a dead woman's hand was enough. Blackwood, for the first time, looked small. He was defeated not by violence, but by memory and ink. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The heavy, oppressive silence had been replaced by a light, breathable peace. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Jacob stopped the wagon. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the golden light. He looked at her for a long time, and she saw in his eyes the end of a long and weary road. He finally said the word she had waited to hear, the word he had been unable to speak. "Stay," he said. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was a statement. It was a plea. It was everything. Back at the house, Rose and Samuel ran out to meet them, their faces bright with a relief they didn't fully understand but could feel in the air. That night, after the children were asleep, Lin Wei went to her small room. She knelt on the floor and opened her worn leather suitcase. One by one, she took out her few belongings, a silk shawl, her small sewing kit, a faded photograph of her parents. She placed each item carefully on the simple wooden shelves Jacob had built for her, until the suitcase was finally, completely empty. Thank you for watching.